I'm back from my overseas trip. Let's talk more about Utena. On Discord, the user Ravioli Lolly Lolly Fuckaroli brought up the idea of Machiavelli's The Prince and that interacting with Utena, which is such clearly an inspiration and such clearly fits into what the Prince in Utena is doing that I'm frankly ashamed that I've never put that together before. Of course, there's the name, but the obvious connection here is that the prince says that the view of how you are perceived is far more important than what actually you have. So you don't actually have to be noble, you just have to be perceived as noble by the people that you're ruling over. It's really made to be a pragmatic guide on manipulating people. Of course, this leads to or calls back to the hypocrisy we see in Akio and his deeds and his perception, but it also kind of leads to that oppressive social structure that Utena and Anthe are struggling against. What's more, the very complicated portrayal of the prince in Utena kind of leads to the ability, or rather necessity, to question the values established in something like the prince. Machiavelli's novel is not on how best to live your life, or a general value philosophy for what humans should all be doing. It's about how a ruler should stay in power, and to his credit, Akio does that. We see that in Utena. Living word for word with that ideology from Machiavelli, you can become powerful of a sort, you can become beloved and feared. But I think this kind of harkens back to the multiple ways of taking down the establishment, or the multiple feminist readings of Utena that we talked about, I think it was in the third episode. The consummate prince, as described by Machiavelli, is a perfect villain, especially when we want to get at the themes of self-actualization, of compassion and understanding, and, establish another value judgment system that is going to be more workable for all human beings in general, or at least for our two protagonists. To go along with that, before we begin, I want to make mention of something that I was thinking about while I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts, The Partially Examined Life, which is about philosophy and kind of highfalutin in a way that I don't necessarily understand all the way. And forgive me if I, make any mistakes or misrepresent this, but they just posted their episode on Nietzsche and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I read bits and pieces of it and tried to make sense of what they were talking about, but I didn't quite get much of it at all. But I think the one thing that really struck me and jumped off the page was the imperative to deny value judgments, or deny judgments that are placed upon you, and really the emphasis of man as the creator of judgments, and that being the laudable or lofty aspect. And of course, I don't think it has any direct connections with the Adolescence of Utena, but we were just talking about value judgments. And I think Ikehara's representation of the prince and the culture that surrounds buying into the idea of the prince mirrors very closely kind of the established value systems that Nietzsche was trying to have people reject in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He talks about the principle of will to power as the fundamental drive of all things, that everything must obey something, and if it can't obey oneself, one must obey someone else. True freedom is only granted to those who can command themselves. Not only does that really sound like the struggle of our two heroines in this show, but I think the structure of the film as well kind of has a similar take to the constant struggle. We said last time that it's not about what happened in the past or the ultimate resolution, but again, about the struggle, about the failing, the reevaluating, the breaking down of the value systems that the characters hold, and rising above those things that you are trapped within. I think you can see in the Adolescence of Utena in particular just how much or how real the struggle is for the will to power. And possibly even if he didn't mean to, I think Ikehara makes a very compelling argument for the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Wow, first frame, here we go. Utena and Anthe in their dual uniforms kissing. That's certainly not a level of intimacy we'd seen with the pair before. Has Utena now, since seeing Anthe's pain, warmed up to her in a physical sense? They did just see each other naked, even if that was a bit metaphorical. Anyway, the pair seems to be more of a partnership right now, which is a bit odd considering the pacing of this scene coming so quickly after Anthe has finally revealed all of her inner demons. There's been no time to talk things out, or for Utena to respond to what Anthe showed to her, and I think that's very deliberate and something that goes on later after this fight scene. In a larger sense of the pacing of the film, you don't necessarily have the time to always think everything through all the way before life comes knocking at your door and you're forced to act. It's a film largely about the communication between Anthe and Utena. It's a pity that Jury comes knocking with her agenda while Anthe and Utena are sorting things out. Remember, Jury's scene was quite some time ago. And I'd like to reference my own dichotomy of grace and glamour again. This is probably the most glamorous shot of the entire show, the one where everyone is buying into the idea of the pomp and circumstance of the duels. And its jarring position between two very intimate, internal, coming to accept things as they they are and appreciate those around you and what happened in the past, grace scenes is very intentional. It's supposed to rip you out of your reverie, much like the glamour distracts Utena from getting at the true grace of the issue that she needs to address and will later address in the next scene. Back in the scene, we have the abruptness of the battle theme coming in with its swell, as if to say, stop this nonsense talking back and forth, it's time for action. And things have never been so black and white, quite literally. We've talked about Igar's penchant for the red and black hyperviolence, but the black and white was the theme all throughout this movie in varying degrees. So this is saying that the characters are thinking of things as starkly as possible. That for both Utena and Anthe and Jury, there is only right and wrong in this scene, and that is why they must fight. You would almost think, though, that Anthe and Utena are past this, that they've shared their pain, they've come together, and that they don't need this anymore. Utena took off her ring. And indeed, what we're shown here is that pulling the sword from Anthe is not the intimate act that it was in some of the series duels, but instead rips them apart physically on the screen. Perhaps that's a larger idea of the prince not being able to be with the princess or the Rose Bride or what have you. And it's also echoed very nicely with Jury and Shiori. There's a lovely dynamism to this whole scene and why I like it so very much. Things come at each other from the edges of the screen. Jury runs to the edge of the screen here, as does Utena. And it's only their clashing when they meet each other that brings the world back into color, or at least some amount of color. And it brings me into talking about one of the things I always love to bring up, which is directionality. I love setting the fight on the bridge, right? As if they walk a balancing act, that there's only one little slim path here, that they're constantly in danger of falling off or messing up and ruining themselves. I take that to mean the performance of trying to be the prince is incredibly precarious, and there's lots of ways to screw it up. As we've talked about, the real princes don't exist in the real world, but instead are memories or figments of people's imaginations. And this scene will do a great job of positioning Utena and Jury based on who's winning the fight, or pushing it back and forth based on their mental states. And of course, continuing on with the directional motif that we saw earlier, both the protagonists run to the right again, which we've associated with going backwards or staying and playing the prince. One thing I like about this early part of the scene is the long lingering shots on the crowd, because it first contrasts with the privacy of the previous scene, but it also shows us how we should interpret the symbol of the fight. Because the fight is necessarily public, we have the reinsertion of society in the expectations of the prince and the desire to overcome other people. We find out Utena's purpose for this fight in a flashback later on, but for now all we need to understand is that she's still beholden to the pressures of the society of Otri Academy and still playing into their value system. And this is wonderful because it allows me the opportunity to talk about conflict, and specifically physical conflict in a visual narrative medium. And the core concept for why you would use fighting in a narrative medium like this, it has to be a bit different from real life, where most fights can just be attributed to, emotional rage or the desire for money or power or things like that. In a narrative, in a story, your fight has to be not just a simple fight. It has to be either a battle of wills in sort of an Ashita no Joe way. It has to be like a battle back and forth between intellects in, a real Keikaku Tori kind of way. Or it has to be a battle of ideologies in a kind of a Sailor Moon way. And that's just a few examples, but the idea is there has to be something more than just the action happening on screen. That is, the fight has to mean something. It has to have stakes. It has to have an element of personality to it, to ground it and make it feel relatable and understandable. Otherwise, you're just watching flashy lights on the screen. So there's a simple test I use to evaluate the narrative impact of an action scene within a movie to determine if it's simply just spectacle or it's really well thought out and does something for the film. And it's look at the turn. That is, what is the mechanism by which the character is availed the day? Why does the person win? Now, Geek Nights talks a lot about this in their breakdowns of Utena, in that the person with the most righteous pursuit, or the one with the most purity of purpose, is the one that comes out the victor in the series of Utena. And I think this perfectly ties back into the idea of the onlooking crowds earlier on. There's a transformation in this fight, right? There's a point where Utena is losing the fight, and then there's a point where Utena changes something and then is then winning the fight. And I believe this change to be when she stops fighting for one purpose and starts fighting for another purpose. But we have to get there first, one thing at a time. First, Anthe's back in her role, and Shiori doesn't care about this fight at all. It doesn't matter who wins or who loses, as long as Juri is still playing the prince and still beholden to her. She of course doesn't give a damn about Juri or anything that's going on with her. Instead, she only wants Juri to continue being her prince, as her deep resentment for her we heard earlier in the film. Anthe's a nice mirror for that. Shiori is active, Anthe is passive. Understandably, with what happened in the past and everybody calling her a witch. However, Anthe does care for Utena, but she inherently shares the same skill set as Shiori. She's the manipulator, she's behind the scenes, she's not the fighter, she's not the prince, she's not trying to be the prince, she's someone living in the prince's world. This of course mirrors with Juri and Utena, both females, both attempting to play the prince here in this scene, and both, with an inherently noble ideology that's going up against each other. So I said we'll get to the turn, and we certainly will, but consider that the only difference here. Utena and Juri are in the same place, so this scene isn't going to be about the fight between those two. Instead, it's about contrasting the relationship of the supporter with the prince, and how even at this stage, before they've reconciled, the pair is inherently different in Utena and Anthe than it is across the shot with Shiori and Juri. And you can see this as Shiori turns to leave, but Anthe stays and watches the whole thing intently. Now, let's put a couple of these things together. First, we know Utena's turn comes. She's losing the duel, gets knocked against the side of the wall, and then picks up her sword and appears as Dios after the flashback where Anthe exposes the Castle of Eternity in the clouds. And there's certainly a ton to talk about even in that scene, with the Castle of Eternity showing up at the end in the car chase scene, with the equation of the contrails to the Castle of Eternity. However, that kind of contrasting with what they saw earlier when we saw the contrails. But let's instead right now just focus on the idea that Utena put back on her ring to do this, to ostensibly obtain the power of the Castle of Eternity, or to enter the Castle of Eternity by winning Anthe. But as we'll see here, maybe that's not entirely the whole story behind why Utena decided to accept this duel. For Anthe, I think this flashback scene is a bit more straightforward. Even though she exposes herself to Utena, she's not ready to live without a prince, or not ready to abandon the idea of the prince, as evident by the scene right before Utena transforms into a car. So in this flashback scene, she's giving Utena a reason, or manipulating her into staying the prince for Anthe's benefit. And as we said, that's a step, right? She's exposed herself to Utena, and that's a level of trust there that she didn't have with anyone else before now, but it's still not an abandonment of the social structure of the prince. So this means that the twist, or the turn in the duel, doesn't inherently come from Anthe. She doesn't do anything or change her perspective on anything in this duel, but instead the turn comes from Utena remembering this scene, but it's her remembering it. So in that way, we can kind of think of this as Utena's second take on what happened. Like, yes, she was manipulated by Anthe into dueling again to be the prince, to ostensibly obtain power and get what Anthe says would be the reward of making her dreams come true. But that's what she would go into the duel with. And that is not enough, or not powerful enough to overcome what Juri goes into the duel with of, the purity of her secret love for Shiori, or, whatever that is, being otherwise implied but mostly assimilated from the series of Utena. The turn comes after she perceives those events in a different light, and that's never specifically stated by anything in the flashback scene or in the duel itself. But I think we can look at the blocking and the directionality of the fight scene and kind of get a better view. She slammed against a door, which is a pretty good metaphor for having an escape or getting out of there and then leaving and running away from the duel, abandoning the idea of playing the prince. But I would look very closely at these shots here. When Utena is looking up, she's not looking up at an angle that would indicate she's looking up at Juri, and it hesitates on her to give us time to show that she's thinking about something. Anthe notices it first. It cuts directly to Anthe, implying that Utena was looking at Anthe. And when she was down on that knee on the turn with her back against the door, with the events of the watchtower in her mind, thinking that over, she looked at Anthe and then made a decision to act like Dios, or embody Dios. We could talk a little bit about what that means in the transformation sense, or in the values associated with Dios. But let's first finish this directionality motif. This shot in particular shows that Utena, from her point of view, is going to blow past Juri, who's protecting the right side of the screen in this duel, again stopping Utena from going to play the prince. and she's going to blow past that and head towards Anthe. So I guess this is kind of an evolution in some ways, right? But not all the way getting there, because she's headed to the right. She's playing the prince here. She's embodying it. She's not giving up on it and taking the door and getting out of the fight. But I believe the turn to have been, she decided she's going to do that because she needs to save Anthe, or she needs to capitalize on that. She may have an idea of the way to get out of Otri Academy, but she's not going to leave Anthe behind. Or maybe it's not so concrete as all that, but the idea is that her value shifts. Her value shifts from obtaining the end of the world or the castle in the sky for purposes of her own desires and, need to resolve her conflict with Toga and her outstanding issues or what have you, but instead to have Anthe not be stuck here. And that, in and of itself, by Geek Knight's, value metric thing of whoever is the most pure intended, or whoever has the best desires, the purest heart, is the winner of the duel, would be enough to flip her ahead of Juri in the purity scale that would be needed to win the duel. Because obviously, fighting for somebody other than yourself is far more noble than fighting for yourself. And that truth is so black and white, it's so evident that it goes back to the black and white when she slices the rose from Juri's breast. And it hits Anthe hard. That is the first time ever since, the Dios was alive, or Akio was Dios, or, whatever it was in the past, that anyone has, genuinely cared for her or wanted to do something for her. And that's a value of Dios. That's a value of the perfect ideal of the consummate prince. Do you see that same type of compassion again as Utena runs off to find Anthe as she transforms into Dios again, thinking about someone other than herself? That's pure in a way that has by now almost been completely lost. And that's fantastic and noble and great, but it's still moving to the right. It's still playing into the idea of the prince and the value of having a prince. It's not going to help Utena or Anthe leave the academy. But I think Utena knows that in that moment and still makes such a powerful choice. That's partially the reason I believe Anthe and Utena were not looking at the castle in the clouds when they were both clothed and first looking at the world from the watchtower. And of course, just the progression of that scene wouldn't make sense if that was exposed much earlier or any earlier than them talking when they were naked. Now, a couple other things that we may have glanced over there, just getting to that message. Akio's grave is dug up, and then Shiori, of course, jumps in with the tape. And it's far too convenient a thing to happen immediately after the duel, especially when Shiori leaves at the start of Juri and Utena's duel. I think it's very heavily implied here that Shiori caused this to happen, or them to dig up Akio's grave, which goes back to the scene with Toga and Shiori where they were repeatedly uncovering the paintings hidden beneath the sheets, which led to Anthe's backstory. But it would also mean that Shiori at least expected Juri to lose the duel, even at the start. So it's really a catch-22 or a self-fulfilling prophecy almost, isn't it? Because Shiori didn't care enough about Juri to stay and watch the duel. She wasn't there to show Juri something to fight for in the way that Anthe was, to raise her guiding morals to the level of where she would be able to fight on behalf of Shiori and not on behalf of her own self. It's this fantastic example and contrast of how shitty a person Shiori is, contrasted with how the trust, the faith, the compassion between Utena and Anthe was able to make a miracle happen. The foil of using this pair to contrast with Anthe and Utena, it's fucking brilliant. Because through contrast, you're allowed to see what values are really important, and how, if the characters embrace them, that they can be manifested into tangible outcomes. Or if the characters reject them, can be thrown away. This is the essence of character-based drama right here. Also, we skipped over the entire thing with Shiori and Juri both knowing about Toga and what that means to Utena. Keep in mind this is a public performance now, and Juri, to maybe gain the upper hand on Utena, says that she knows of Toga, which in the first part of the fight is the reason why Utena is fighting. So if that secret is marginalized or invalidated or used as a power against her in the fight, then of course she's going to lose. Of course, too, Mickey exposes the fact that he has never heard of Toga, which we've been going for hours and hours about this, so that's no surprise to us. We've seen this movie already, but your first time watching it through, that would be the most shocking thing in the world coming off the series, and would be eminently confusing and just a terrible, visceral, and obvious, hey, gotcha from Ikahara to everybody who would be watching this film for the first time. So with Utena's secret exposed having failed, then Shiori moves to expose Anthy's secret. Of course, she has the wrong videotape, as we talked about in the last episode, but that's neither here nor there. Also, more directionality. This is a low part. Anthy obviously buried this information. The directions of up and down, maybe we'll talk about that a bit more when it comes to the next scene with Utena descending and descending. But Utena and Anthy are kind of above that history, both figuratively and literally. And Anthy looking down, we get a nice reaction shot of her frowning before she completely disappears. And again, of course, the fact that Shiori was one of the radio girls as the shadows go back and forth, and then she jumps out from behind the pillar where the shadows were. There's actually no chapter break in the movie here, which is kind of odd. I get that the following scene, comes right after the events of the previous scene, but the music changes and there's a whole tonal shift. So in way of kind of wrapping up this episode, because we brought up a lot of stuff that I was actually super interested to, dive into, is kind of the more general thing in Japanese culture, kind of the stigma that goes along with any accusation of a crime. I remember being in Akihabara and going around visiting the stores with an expat friend, and they're all open to the road, and it's very tightly packed, so there's a lot of stuff right by the front, right opening, no security, no anything like that. And I said to my expat friend, I said, Jen, it would be very easy to steal something here. And she said, yeah, it would. However, no one ever would steal anything, because the shame of being caught as a thief would far outweigh the value of anything that you could possibly steal from one of these stores. And that fact kind of took me aback until I really learned more about the hard social structure there is in many East Asian countries, and Japan's no exception to this. There's over a 99% conviction rate when anyone is accused of a crime. And what's more, there's this social obligation that as soon as somebody is undesirable or vilified or, said to have been a bad person, then it is in your best interest not to associate with that person any longer. You see this in stuff like the actor for one of the Yakuza games being caught doing cocaine, and then they removed all rendition of his character and completely wrote his character out of the game that was already released. Or Aya Hirano, that whole big debacle that happened back when Haruhi was super big, of her sleeping with the members of the band or the drummer in the band and ruining her idol image, and how far Kodakawa and the production company distanced themselves from her, and it kind of ended her career as a voice actress. In many ways in these East Asian cultures, I know Korean culture does this specifically too, I've talked to people about it, that your image is everything. Standing up for somebody or defending somebody is almost unheard of completely. Your parents will forget about you. Even your closest friends will not associate with you anymore, because the social structure is so strong that they can't risk their own social standing in order to, stand by you. I mean, it's that same social structure that prevents people from stealing, or when you say sort your trash by burnable or decomposable trash, everyone does it. It's the other side of that coin that says when you're outside of this social structure, we don't want you. So you see a lot of the good art from, the turn of the millennium, or, when anime becomes popular, talking about this issue, about this repression, and it's something that Ikahara has definitely said he's hated in the past. And of course he would hate it. He's far, far outside what's normal for a Japanese person. And I hope that gives a little more context for why Anthy is so defensive and so fearful when her secret gets out. So anyway, with all that behind us, there's no more build-up. We're kind of on the downslope of this film. So now it's all about the characters overcoming their issues and then moving on. We'll talk about how Utena is able to identify that and move past it, and then also how Anthy very much isn't, as well as real-life princes, the Black Rose arc in its entirety, and more about directionality when we come back for the next episode of Breaking Down Adolescence of Utena.